I'll toss it over to Ken to talk about turfgrass disease management.
Okay, thanks, Ed, and thank you for allowing me to come and visit for a little bit. As Matt said, and thank you, Matt, for the introduction. You're very generous in your comments, no matter how true false they are. I bet I could find a lot more people that know more than I do, but I appreciate you saying that. You know, one of the things that we'll do today is just really kind of go through a few things about, you know, basic understanding of how to manage diseases in turfgrass, specifically directed towards lawn care. We're not going to cover every single possible disease that you could run across in lawn care, but we'll use some as examples that you may commonly face. And I've tried to incorporate both cool and warm season diseases in this discussion. But certainly if you have questions about a disease that you are dealing with, or if you've had observations in the past about a disease that we'll discuss that have worked well for you, then please feel free to share either through the Q&A or the chat box. But that's kind of how we'll walk through this. We do have a couple of scheduled breaks. So when you see name of a disease in big letters and exclamation marks, we'll take maybe, let's say, a 5-minute break, and then we'll move on after that. Okay, so without further ado, here we go. Let's get this train rolling. And you know, as Matt mentioned earlier, you know, it's always good before you even get into trying to figure out how to manage a disease or trying to identify a disease, you know, to develop a solid plan. Okay. And it can be applied no matter what you're facing. First and foremost, the number one thing that you need to make sure you understand how to do is identify the problem. You know, is it a disease? Is it an insect? As far as the damage you're seeing, if it's a weed, what kind of weed is it? There's a lot of weeds that look alike, and same for diseases. You know, a lot of diseases can look very similar, but also diseases and the symptoms that you see could mimic and could be very similar to environmental stresses or even cultural damage from, say, scalping or just too aggressive of cultural practices and things of that nature, or cultivation practices. Once you identify the problem, the next step in my mind is, okay, well, how do we correct it? What are we going to do now for our customers? Because they're demanding a 100% green lawn with no flaws all the time, right? As long as that turf grass is growing. So how do we correct the problem? But also you need to make sure not just to stop there, because your job doesn't stop right after you've solved the problem. Okay. So the next thing is okay, so how do I keep it from happening? What do I need to do next time around, you know, to prevent this from happening, or to strengthen the turf grass to where we can minimize the amount of damage that we may see if it occurs again. And so it's always good to kind of do a recap of what you've done every season, what worked, what didn't work, what adjustments can you make that all align with your capabilities, with your budget, and everything. So just a few things to keep in mind, and that's kind of how we're going to approach things as we go through this. Typically, as we talk about problems, you have unnatural problems and natural problems. You know, another way to look at that is, you may have heard the term biotic stresses. You know, biotic stress is a natural problem. Typically, these occur in inconsistent patterns. One moment, please. Okay, excuse me. As I was saying, natural problems occur, irregular shaped edges around the damage areas, whereas, excuse me, those are abiotic stresses are natural problems. Unnatural or abiotic stresses are typically, they have very distinct patterns, okay? So they're gonna have the patterns that are straight lines, very defined edges where the damages occur. So example of an unnatural problem would be scalping, okay? Or a natural problem would be a disease. So, however, they don't always occur that way all the time, do they? Because a lot of times you may have a problem where you have something like this. You know, you have a lot of circular and irregular patterns combined in this picture, and right off the bat, without asking any questions, one may think that this is a disease. But if you look more closely and you look and ask more questions, and questions are important, you see this is a very distinct circle here, very distinct circles here. And notice how, you know, this is, you know, the turf type you have to consider is also a key. This is a cool season turf. There's no turf grass regrowing or any signs of regrowth in these patches. So those are indicators that you can look for to discern whether or not it's a disease or something else that's going on. Typically, even if it's a disease like brown patch in the yard, you're still going to have some kind of plant material that's not 100% blighted or damaged, so that you can see key symptoms. So in this particular case, it's a non-selective herbicide damage. Frost damage is very common down in, especially down in Florida in the Panhandle, in the coastal regions as you go up the Atlantic coast, where you get an early spring, you get that nice green flush of growth coming up early, and then what happens almost every year, you get a late frost, and you can see this occur. It's superficial. It tends to bounce back after this, but you can see some damage that people can get it confused with some type of disease or other things going on. The thing that you notice in this picture, there's a very distinct line in this picture. So this is fertilized versus unfertilized. You know, remember that diseases don't occur in straight lines. Okay, so this is just a simple, the lawn on the left is being maintained with proper fertility. The lawn on the right is not. So just understanding what's happened on the lawn, you know, what you've done, in addition to, you know, what the homeowner or your customer has done, is going to really help you narrow down what's going on as you're going through your action plan. Here's one that if you live in the cool season market, certainly quite common. This is road salt damage. Notice the pattern again. It's starting from the road and going away from the road, following the drainage of the water, following where a snowplow may be going. So in the low areas is where you're seeing the most concentrated areas of damage, where that salt is concentrated. So again, very defined pattern. If you look here, that, I mean, it's pretty distinct, where it's just this area right here and this area here. There's no real damage going on here. So if it was a disease, if you have this much damage in these two spots, you would think that there would be some damage here in this area right here. But that's not the case in this situation. So again, this would be considered an abiotic stress, an unnatural stress. And then unfortunately, in certain situations, you have these things that occur. You know, this is an application error. Notice there's a distinct pattern. There's a zigzag pattern to this lawn, or in this lawn, as far as where the damage is occurring. Unfortunately, in this case, it was an applicator using a hose end sprayer, was not properly calibrated, probably a little bit too low to the ground, and the output was a little bit higher, more concentrated effect. And so the coverage wasn't being where it needed to be. You weren't getting the adequate coverage. So that's why you were seeing this distinct pattern here. So I don't know of a disease that that shows up in symptoms as a zigzag. So those are kind of things that we can look at and look for when we're trying to diagnose whether it's a disease or if it's an abiotic stress. Okay. You know, like everything, diseases have life cycles. You know, typically, you know, this is an example of brown patch, Rhizoctonia solani. You know, they have very specific conditions where they begin development of fruiting bodies and vegetative materials like mycelium here, very distinct 90-degree branching. If you look at Rhizoctonia solani underneath a microscope, you'll see these very distinct branchings. So it needs, and we'll go through this here in a little bit, but you know, it needs, diseases need very specific conditions, environmental conditions to grow in. You know, if you don't have one or the other, you don't see that infection. But ultimately, what happens is you begin to see that life cycle continue from developing the young mycelium to eventually getting into the basidiospores, and how it spreads from one plant to the next, causing wilting and death, and then forming these bulbils here that can then create more mycelium and then eventually overwinter. There are several diseases that overwinter in the thatch layer of turf. I'm sure you've heard numerous talks where they talk about the importance of thatch management from a disease control standpoint. So a lot of diseases that you face can overwinter in that thatch layer, and then once the conditions are right for the next year, then it becomes another problem. So really, as we're getting into disease management, you have to take into consideration everything that you do, because remember, you're being hired to manage the turf grass. You're not being hired to only control the disease that may or may not occur. You're not being hired to only control the insects or weeds. You're being hired to deliver a premium product to your customer, which is a dense dark green lawn through the growing season. And that's what's going to create new business for you, help retention, your customer retention, and all of those good things. So managing these areas like, you know, proper fertility and water management, improving drainage as you can. You know, I know a lot of you had different types of businesses. Maybe this is an area that you offer as an add-on service. But mowing, proper mowing height and frequency is very important, especially as you get into, you know, some of your grasses like St. Augustine grass or tall fescue. As you know, the mowing height, if you mow those grasses too low, then the level of stress increases on those plants, which just does nothing more than just invite pests to occur. And then also controlling other pests is part of that. So it's just putting this all together as you're developing a management plan. So how do some of the other tools that you can look at? You know, one of the things is prevent pest introduction. How do you do that? Well, making sure your equipment is cleaned. You know, after, you know, before each day, you know, you can do what you can to remove any sprigs or any plant material that's been left on mowers or aerification equipment, that type of thing. If you're being hired to replace install sod, making sure you're buying sod from a quality grower, going to go on site to inspect that sod, make sure it's clean of weeds and things of that nature that you can at least see. With diseases, it's going to be a challenge because it can be the cleanest turfgrass out there, but if it's susceptible to a disease and the environmental conditions are correct, then that disease is going to occur. However, with new breeding technologies coming along, there are certain turf grasses that are resistant and less susceptible to certain diseases. For example, there's ryegrasses now that are less susceptible to gray leaf spot. Same with tall fescue and brown patch. So you're continuing to see these new lines of turfgrass types that are being released. So keep an eye on those, because that's an idea and a way of preventing pest introduction. Once it's introduced, as far as a new turfgrass type, or if an existing is in place, then properly maintaining that turfgrass is key. And we just kind of touched on some of those basic approaches, understanding how to maximize your time by effectively managing that turf. Identifying the pest and learning the life cycle. You may ask, why is it important to learn the life cycle of a pest? Well, certain pests are easier to control in the early stages of development, or from a preventative standpoint as compared to a curative standpoint. Take all root rot, for example, on St. Augustine grass. Once you see the just down and out symptoms of take all root rot in St. Augustine grass, it's very difficult to manage from that standpoint. So if you're in a situation like that where that take all root rot, for example, is going to be a problem, what can you do on the front end to prevent those types of diseases to occur or from occurring? And then your control practices all involve cultural, mechanical, chemical. All of these can play an important role in managing diseases and pests in general. We talk a little bit about the importance of fertility and disease management. Balanced fertility is very important. You'll hear me talk about this as we get to a few diseases throughout this little presentation. But it's not always the case. And that's something that is a challenge, because what may work for one turfgrass type on one disease may not work for the other turfgrass type with the same disease. What I mean by that is, with brown patch, the old adage, if you go back to the old Kentucky 31 tall fescue days, applying nitrogen and too much nitrogen with Kentucky 31 really stimulated brown patch development. But nowadays, what the research is demonstrating, and this is kind of what we're seeing here on the right side here, is research out of NC State University. With these newer cultivars, you're not seeing as drastic of an effect on brown patch and tall fescue as it's being fertilized throughout the summer. Notice that these here, this is brown patch severity, and the A's here means there's no statistical difference between no fertility or fertilizing throughout the year. So those are the things that we can learn from with these newer cultivars and newer practices with current research. However, does that mean that can be applied with all diseases? Not necessarily. I don't, because you still have to be mindful of, pythium and things of that nature, which, applying fertility during hot, humid conditions, it may not affect these newer cultivars, a tall fescue. But if there's ryegrass in there and you see, flushes of growth, and hot, humid conditions, that could be ripe for the picking for Pithy. So just, again, balance fertility and using your knowledge on how to manage these turfgrass types is going to be really important for you and helpful as you are going through and trying to manage that turfgrass the best for your customer. So it's really about just putting it all together. Using fungicides is only one piece of the puzzle. Knowing what you can, learning every day, taking advantage of, whether they're regional meetings through different lawn care associations or webinars like this. Hopefully you'll take a few nuggets away from this, but learning how to properly put all your tools in play to deliver that to your customer, that turfgrass that they're asking for. I mentioned this little briefly, this little triangle, and I'm sure you've seen this if you've ever sat in a disease webinar or presentation. There's 3 key factors that you must have in order to have a susceptible or a disease outbreak. One is a susceptible host, an active pathogen, and favorable environment. This year has been an interesting year, in a lot of areas of this country, because we've had in several regions hot, dry conditions. Okay, Texas, for example, has been extremely hot and extremely dry for the last month. So even if you have a susceptible host and a pathogen ready to go, the environment is not suitable for that pathogen to develop. In other parts of the country, we've seen a considerable amount of rain, and right after that, you get hot, humid conditions. Now you've got moisture, and you have a susceptible host, and you have a pathogen that's active. Then you start to see some disease. So, those are types of things that you have to have in order for disease development to occur. I guess one could ask the question, if you're in a hot, dry conditions now and the turf is under stress, or disease is going to be more likely to occur on those types of turf grasses going into the fall than other areas. Again, that's quite possible because you're going into a dormant season with a turf grass that's already damaged. But in general, this is kind of what we talk about. It doesn't matter if it's a foliar pathogen like brown patch, or a root pathogen like summer patch, or just lost my train of thought. Spring dead spot. You can see that some in lawn care and things of that nature, Bermuda grass and zoysia grass lawns. So those are types of things that can impact the roots. So this is an example of another disease that can occur on Bermuda grass. But again, notice the difference. Say, for example, between this picture and the picture that I showed at the beginning on cool season turf. Those were, you had a mixture in that picture of very circular patterns and some irregular patterns, but there was nothing coming back in the middle. Okay. Here, you see irregular shape patterns. You see some that are almost circular or completely circular, but they're not. But in the middle, you're seeing regrowth, and not a complete kill. This particular turf grass, this is Bermuda grass. The previous was tall fescue. So in those situations, we are talking about 2 different diseases. But my point is, there are differences between this disease, spring dead spot, and the disease of the symptoms of a non-selective herbicide that we saw earlier. But also notice the difference as far as the regrowth. You're starting to see lateral growth back into these spots Whereas with a cool season turf like a bunch type grass, you wouldn't see that. You would have to reseed. But in this particular situation, spring dead spot is a disease that the pathogen is active in the fall when soil temperatures are, reach 70 degrees. And, from a preventative standpoint, fungicides need to be applied there. And then the symptoms show up in the spring as dead spots. So spring dead spot. So you need to have those three key factors for you to see disease symptoms occur. Diagnosing a disease, we kind of went through some of the problem solving earlier in the year. In the presentation. So now we're getting more specific to disease. I think the first thing that we need to look for are signs and symptoms. So signs of disease are when you're actually able to see evidence of a pathogen on the host. So if you're out in the morning on a property and you see mycelium, or so this would be examples of dollar spot, and a lot of times you can see mycelium with brown patch, and if it's under hot humid conditions you'll see that with pythium blight as well. So that's a sign of a disease. It's something that you can visually see, leaf spots, but symptoms deal with how it's basically changing the appearance and the function of the plant. So if you see water soaked turf, or you see the turf start to become chlorotic or yellowing, necrotic or necrosis, that's basically more blighted turf. The turf is starting to turn brown, canopy thinning. Those are some examples of symptoms of a disease. So if you think about brown patch, and you start to see these irregular shaped, circular patterns develop in a property, and you're you're figuring out what's going on. It's on tall fescue, so a thing or two about tall fescue management and how susceptible it can be. And so you go back the next morning, you see some signs of mycelium, and you get down in there and you look at the lesions on the leaf blade, and you see that characteristic pattern of the leaf of those lesions. Then that's what kind of gets you going through the checklist and leads you to brown patch. So that's why it's important for proper diagnosis. Those are the types of things that lead you down the right path, because you don't want to misdiagnose a disease and then spend all the money for a fungicide if your customer is demanding that you do that, or not demanding, but asking you to provide that service, and then it doesn't work because the product that you used was targeting this one disease that you thought it was, but it was actually another. So and there's plenty of really good diagnosis tools out there to help you go down that path and understand what's what. And there's also a lot of very knowledgeable people in the industry. If you need somebody to come take a look at a property, they're willing to do that. At least hopefully they are. Recommendations and follow-ups, again, answering questions to help eliminate diseases that can help you really understand what's going on and what's working. If you need to, there's diagnostic labs to send out to properly identify, is another way of identifying correctly a disease. Questions are always important, as I mentioned. That helps you figure out what's what and what's not. Okay, so if it's if the conditions aren't matching up to a specific disease, then you can eliminate that particular disease because it's too hot or too cold for that particular pathogen to be active at that during that time of the year. Recommendations are important because this is basically what you're going to tell your customers you're going to do, okay, to remedy the current situation, but also here's some things that we're going to be doing to prevent it from happening again, or minimizing its impact for the following season. And then follow up to see if what you recommended and what you did worked, because that's important, because you don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over again if it's not working. So if you go in and you do something, it doesn't work, figure out why, and then if you need to make changes, then make those changes. Okay. Causes of diseases we've looked at already, kind of abiotic or unnatural man-made type factors, improper management practices, mechanical damage. So, not applying enough fertilizer, overwatering, scalping or improper mowing height. Those are types of things that can stress the turfgrass out and incite disease. Biotic factors, of course, fungi are associated with diseases, believe it or not. But then insects and weeds and nematodes that can cause stress or minimize the ability of the turfgrass to compete can create opportunities for diseases to occur. So that's the things that's again, going back to putting all of our tools together to manage all of this can help us maintain that competitive turfgrass. Fungi themselves can be saprophytic or parasitic. Saprophytic is essentially a disease that feeds off organic matter, something like fairy ring. A lot of your diseases are parasitic as well. They can occur on the foliage, or the crown of the plant, or the roots. A lot of different diseases that you infect. So dollar spot and brown patch are more foliar diseases. And I mentioned things like summer patch in cool season turf, take all root rot. On warm season turf is an example of a root infecting disease. That's why it's very important for fungicide placement. It's key for fungicide placement, because you want to make sure you are delivering that active ingredient to where the pathogen is. So it's not going to do you much good to place a contact fungicide and leave it on the foliage if you're trying to go after a root pathogen. Okay. So how do you do that? Especially in lawn care, a lot of times you're not dealing with an irrigation system. So making sure that your application volumes are correct, and things of that nature to deliver that fungicide down to where it needs to go. Different characteristics as far as reproductive structures. A lot of diseases will create, or fungi will create spores, as well as hyphae as main areas of ways that they can spread from plant to plant. Basically involves, as far as the infection process, 3 different steps. The placement of the reproductive structure. So say if it's a spore and it lands on the leaf, then how it enters the plant, and the parasitism is basically how it steals nutrients and the like from the plant to survive and spread. There's different types of colonization. So this is an example of localized colonization. This is a leaf spot disease where the symptoms that you're seeing are localized. They're not covering from one side of the leaf blade to the next. Initially, they're fairly localized. Generalized, this is, would be an example of brown patch. So it's a general area that's been colonized. This is very typical of a brown patch lesion, where it really starts from the edge of the leaf blade and works its way through those distinct brown to maroon margins on the leaf, on the edge of those lesions. And then systemic colonization is all over. We don't typically deal with a whole lot of systemic types of diseases in turf. This is actually a picture of St. Augustine grass decline. but with breeding and a lot of advancements in St. Augustine grass breeding, you don't see this very often anymore, if at all. So, but just as an example, systemic colonization is, you see the entire plant that's being effective and colonized, being affected. Just an example again of how, once that spore lands and produces a germ tube, it creates an infection peg that is able to penetrate the cell wall and move into the plant and begin to disrupt the normal function of the cells in the plants and cause the symptoms that you see. A couple of fungicide categories that you deal with. Contact fungicides. These are fungicides that typically they'll hit the leaf blade and that's where they stay. They don't move up or down in the plant. So they usually remain on the plant surface for a shorter period of time because they're just being mowed off and they don't enter and translocate into the plant. So examples of this would be something like mancozeb or chlorthalonil, which is more of a golf fungicide, but that's a good example of a contact. You have acropodal penetrants. These are fungicides that penetrate the plant surfaces and then they move upwards into the plant. So they're able to get inside the plant, the vascular system, the xylem, and then they'll move up into the plant. A lot of times you can see these being applied to the foliage or driven down into the roots, and then they get translocated back up into the foliage. Examples of these would be some of your DMIs, as well as your QOI fungicides like fluoxystrobin or FAME. And then you have a local penetrant or localized penetrant. Sometimes people say this is a fungicide that penetrates the leaf, but only moves a short distance away from where it originally entered the plant. So it doesn't move through the xylem like an acropodal penetrant does, but it just gets in and stays. A lot of these types of materials can be translaminar, meaning they move to the other side of the leaf blade, but mostly they sit right there where they are. Excuse me. Examples of this, these, by the way, don't move in the xylem or the phloem. Like I've mentioned, they just stay where they are. Iprodine, vinclozolin are some that are like this. Trifloxysulfuron is another example of a localized penetrant that just enters and just doesn't move far. Okay. We'll keep going and we'll just look at some common diseases that you may run across in lawns. And we'll be brief about this because I know we're running short on time. So we talked a little bit about brown patch today. This is an interesting pathogen, Rhizoctonia solani, because there are diseases like brown patch that occurs on tall fescue and other cool season turf types. But it also can be a pathogen on warm season turf, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But this is a disease that occurs when you get into those temperatures that are greater than 80 degrees in the daytime and above 65 degrees at night with extended periods of leaf wetness. Tall fescue is probably mostly associated with this disease. Notice the distinct lesions that you can have where these lesions really develop and they start kind of on the leaf margin and grow out. And in more severe situations, they can coalesce and form these larger lesions that run across the leaf blade. Okay, they'll have that distinct margin around the lesion there. That's more of a dark maroon color. It can produce mycelium, as I mentioned before. Most of the time you see this only in the early parts of the morning, when the dew is still present on the leaf material. Don't get these confused with spider webs and things of that nature. But culturally, again, we talked earlier about, avoiding high rates of nitrogen when conditions are favorable to brown patch. I think that's still applicable, but, with the advancement of new turfgrass types and varieties, you are starting to see turf grasses, tall fescues that aren't as susceptible to brown patch as the older variety. So if you're in an area that is constantly battling brown patch on tall fescue, that may be something you want to look at, is some of these newer varieties that are more brown patch resistant. Certainly reducing leaf wetness in the late afternoon, it's going to be important if you have any kind of control over the irrigation system, but a lot of times you unfortunately don't have that control. You can just make the recommendation. In many situations, you'll be dealing with, if you're called on to treat for brown patch, most often it could be a curative situation where symptoms have already developed. There are some good fungicides out there to control brown patch. Certainly FAME does a great job. This is on a tall fescue in North Carolina, very effective control. This is non-treated, almost 30% disease. So very effective product for curative brown patch. Large patch, again, the same genus and species, slightly different variety, if I believe, of disease. Now, this is called large patch. It's very common to see on zoysia grass, as well as St. Augustine grass. This is one that typically occurs in the cooler parts of the year, in the fall. Once you're starting to see those temperatures decrease, below 80 degrees, you're getting excessive irrigation or rainfall in those areas that create real dense, or excuse me, damp conditions. Typically, you'll see, if you see symptoms, you'll see almost like an orangish margin around these large patches, with still green turf in the middle sometimes. The recommendations for timing of treatments really depending on the turfgrass type. They say if you're dealing with St. Augustine grass, once those soil temperatures get around 80 degrees or starting to drop below 80 degrees, then that's your trigger to make those applications in the fall. For zoysia grass, the recommendation is for 70 degrees. Again, importance of nutrient management and irrigation is a big thing. Mowing can spread the disease. So if you're in a disease area, you may want to think about just reincorporating those or collecting leaf material if you're mowing. There are some good strobilurin fungicides out there, such as FAME for large patch control as well. Dollar spot is one that can occur on both cool and warm season turfgrass. It's probably a little more common during the growing season in cool season turf. Warm season turf, it tends to be, you may see this on Bermuda grass and zoysia grass in the spring. Typically, it's more prolonged in cool season turf, where you see that, those temperatures in the 50 to 80 degree range under extended periods of leaf wetness. An example of what it can look like on higher cut turf, it almost looks like snow. Adequate nitrogen is important. Irrigation and mowing is important as well when you're dealing with these types of diseases, like dollar spot. Here's a close-up picture of this is on Kentucky bluegrass, just all the mycelium in that foggy morning. It was really bad there. If you're on lower cut turf, if you have a high profile property, the symptoms may look a little different. You may see something that's more like what you would see on a golf course, and those spots that are almost the size of a silver dollar. One that's really causing issues these days, is gray leaf spot. This is a disease that can occur on St. Augustine grass. It can occur on ryegrass. It's a big issue on ryegrass, but now we're seeing more and more of it on tall fescue. and it's coming, all through the Northeast, in the Mid-Atlantic areas, and into the Midwest. So this is a disease that is really starting to develop and become a problem, especially under the hot, humid conditions that certain areas can see. Initially, it looks kind of like drought stress, but then what you see, those leaves start to fall over, and it almost looks like that leaf is about to fall in half and come back around on itself, on something like a tall fescue or a ryegrass. That's when you're dealing with something like a gray leaf spot. But also notice the lesions. They almost look like brown patch, but they are different, especially when they're smaller. They're very distinct spots. Culturally, I mentioned looking at resistant varieties, especially if you're in an area that is dealing with ryegrass, managing leaf wetness, avoiding late afternoon or evening irrigation. That's certainly a big issue. One thing that you can try to avoid if possible, to minimize that leaf wetness. And then if you can decrease shade, increase air movement, that's another thing that you can do. So certainly on St. Augustine grass, this is one that also occurs, and a big problem on St. Augustine grass here. You can actually see the gray middle part of that leaf margin. That's why it gets its gray leaf spot idea. But again, very similar patterns where it's under hot, humid conditions. It can develop very rapidly on St. Augustine grass. Contact fungicides are available. In certain QOI fungicides, tropillium fungicides can be effective on gray leaf spot. Just real quickly, for some of the folks up in the northern areas that you may be dealing with, snow mold can be an issue, whether it be gray snow mold or microdocium patch. It can be a big issue, especially in the spring. The main thing, what we want to do from a cultural standpoint, is avoiding late season fertilizer using a solid soluble nitrogen source. You don't want to get a huge flush of growth right at the end of the season, right before snow cover. We also want to make sure that we are mowing the turf all the way up to dormancy, so we can maintain that consistent height and canopy structure. In the spring, if you do see symptoms of snow mold after it melts, you can rake those areas, and those areas will recover as you're seeding and reapplying fertilizer. And then we talked about take-all root rot again earlier, so I won't go into a whole lot of detail. It is a root pathogen. It's very destructive on St. Augustine grass. This is one where if you're applying the right nutrient ratio, you can manage it from a preventative standpoint. Depending upon the turf type, you can use this type of approach to lower the pH. I don't think it's recommended for St. Augustine grass, or maybe for something like Centipedegrass, you can use this approach. But for St. Augustine grass, it's really important to manage your nitrogen and potassium ratios. So, and I'm just trying to finish up a little bit, but really, because I know we're all out of time, but basic thing, first and foremost, establishing that competitive turf. Understanding how to identify the pest, the disease, is going to make your job a lot easier, and it'll be a lot more directed to how you can manage that, and setting up your plan to apply those fungicides appropriately, whether it's a root pathogen or a foliar pathogen, and really to set you up to be successful and deliver that product to your customer that they are hiring you to do. So that's basically all I have. I apologize for going a little long.
Thanks, everybody.
See ya.